To make a jacket with the size from 1 to 2 years old baby, I used 430 grams of this yarn from the brand Casasol. I used more amount of yarn of the light pink than the dark pink because I made the hood with the light pink. .5 knitting needles. I am using here circular needles, but you can use also straight needles. The cable of the circular needles is 80 centimeters. You also need 4 stitch markers, scissors, needle, and in my case 4 buttons. Start casting on 70 stitches. You have to cast on 70 stitches using 2 threads of the same yarn. I will cast on 70 stitches. You can use the weight to cast on that you prefer. Now you have to make 1 knit stitch on each stitch, 70 knit stitches, and you have to work the garter stitch in all the jacket. Work the garter stitch. Remember to work the garter stitch. Work the second row also with 1 knit stitch on each stitch. 1 knit stitch around, but you have to purl the last stitch. Always purl the last stitch of the jacket. You have to continue working the garter stitch. Remember making 1 knit stitch in all the stitches and 1 purl stitch at the last stitch. Once you have 20 centimeters of the hood, we are going to separate the part of the front, the one arm, the back, the other arm, and the last front. In my case, I placed 14 stitches, 1 stitch to make the yoke, 10 stitches, 1 stitch to make the yoke, 18 stitches for the back part, 1 stitch to make the yoke, again 10 stitches, 1 stitch to make the yoke, and at the end 14 stitches again. Start now with the rows with increases. We have to take the edge stitch, work the knit stitch to the stitch marker, and once you are at the stitch marker, you have to make 1 increase. Before the stitch marker, you have to take this loop between the 2 stitches, place it on the left needle and knit it, taking the back loop. 1 increase. You have to work now the stitch of the stitch marker, and you have to make another increase after the stitch marker. Repeat the same, take the loop between the 2 stitches, place it on the left needle and knit it, taking the back loop. Continue working the knit stitch to the next stitch marker. Once you are at the next stitch marker, you have to make again 1 increase before, knit the stitch marker, and 1 increase after the stitch marker. You have to make 2 increases on each stitch marker. Continue working the knit stitch to the next stitch marker and repeat the increases. You have to repeat the 2 increases 4 times on this row. Once you are at the end, remember to purl the last stitch. You have to turn, and now you have to work only the knit stitch. You don't have to make increases on the wrong side of the jacket. Work the knit stitch to the end. And make again 1 row with increases. You have to make the knit stitch to the first stitch marker, once you are at the stitch marker, you have to make 1 increase, knit the stitch marker and 1 increase. And repeat the same to the next stitch marker, knit all the stitches to the next stitch marker, and make one increase, knit one and one increase. This is what you have to repeat in all the stitch markers to the end. And once you are at the end, you have to turn and work the knit stitch to the end. This is how you have to make the increases. Once I made 9 rows with increases, 18 rows, one with increase and one without increases, I will make the buttonholes, the first buttonholes, and I will change one of the strands of the yarn. I will cut one of the light pink yarn and I will place one of the dark pink yarn. Place the new color, and now you have to knit the first stitch. You don't have to slip the first stitch because you are adding a new color. And let's see how you have to make the buttonhole. You have to knit 3, make a yarn over, and knit the 2 following stitches together but taking the back loop. This is how you have to make the buttonhole. Continue with knit 4 and make again one buttonhole with yarn over and knit 2 together, taking the back loop. Continue making the increases on the yoke. Remember one increase before the stitch marker, knit the stitch marker, and one increase after the stitch marker. You have to continue increasing to have 13 rows with increases, so 26 rows, one with increase and one without increase. Now we are going to separate the sleeves. You have to continue working the knit stitch, also with one in light pink and the other with dark pink. Make the knit stitch to arrive at the stitch marker. Leave the stitch of the stitch marker, the stitch of the yoke, leave it with the front part. And continue working the stitches of the sleeve to arrive at the following stitch marker. And you have to leave the stitch of the yoke on the back. Once you finished knitting all the stitches of the sleeve, you have to turn and continue working the stitches only of the stitches of the sleeve with the knit stitch to arrive at the first stitch marker. You made now the stitches, only the stitches of the sleeve. You can remove the stitch marker and turn again. And continue with the garter stitch with the stitches, only the stitches of the sleeve. Once you made 20 rows with the garter stitch with no increases and decreases, now you have to change the last part of light pink that you have. You have to place now 2 parts of the dark pink and continue working the garter stitch with the dark pink, with the 2 strands of dark pink. And you have to make 24 rows with the 2 strands of dark pink. Once you have the length of the sleeve that you want, you can now bind off the stitches. Remember how you have to bind off the stitches. Take the yarn, take the first stitch, knit 1, pass the first stitch over the second stitch, knit 1, pass the first stitch over the second stitch, knit 1 again, and this is how you have to bind off the stitches of the sleeve. Once you finish the sleeve, we have to continue with the part of the back of the jacket. Remember, you have to leave the stitches of the front part on the needle. Place again 1 strand of light pink, 1 strand of dark pink. And continue working the knit stitch to the second stitch marker. Remember, you have to make the back part, leave the stitch marker, the stitch of the stitch marker in the back part, and continue working to the following stitch marker with the last stitch marker. Then you have to turn and work only the stitches of the sleeve. Continue with the knit stitch to the stitch marker of the back part. You have to repeat the same that you made with the other sleeve here. Once you finished the second sleeve, you have to place again the light pink and the dark pink to make the last part of the jacket with the front part. Once you are at the end, you have on the needles the two front parts and the back part, and what you have to make now is to join those three parts to complete the part of the body. So knit the front part, work the garter stitch to finish the front part, and now you have to join, only continue working the garter stitch on the back part. And once you finish the back part with the knit stitch, you have also to make the knit stitch to finish the last front part. And you joined now the three parts of the body, and you only have to turn and continue working the garter stitch on the stitches that you have on the needle. You have to work the garter stitch with the two strands, one with light pink and one with dark pink, to have the same number of rows that you made with those combination of colors on the sleeves. And then once you have those rows, you have to add the dark pink and cut the light pink yarn. You have to make 40 rows with the 2 strands of dark pink, and you also have to make, if you want, an extra pair of buttonholes. And once you have the 40 rows with the dark pink, you have to bind off all the stitches of the body. Now you only have to sew the sleeves, the bottom part of the sleeves. And you also have to sew the top part of the hood. And you also have to sew the buttons on the other part that you have the buttonholes. And you finished your jacket.